Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the sixth talk in the Only One Theme talk series, which is around innovation management. Our topic for today is only licensing, and our speaker is Dr. K. Vijayraghavan. Let me briefly introduce him. Dr. Vijay is a technology management professional, a registered technology transfer practitioner, and recently he was felicitated as the Fellow of the Society for Technology Management. He has 3 decades of engagement in innovation translation to economic impact creation, intellectual assets management, and innovation policy advisory. Dr. Vijay combines his academic background in life sciences, strategic management, finance, intellectual property, and translational research to provide global corporations and public institutions vision and strategic direction to lead in their chosen spheres of engagement. In his capacity as the chairman and CEO of Sadhguru Management Consultants, Dr. Vijay supports private enterprises in staying on the edge of innovation-led competitive advantage. With Sadhguru's presence in USA and emerging regions of Asia, Vijay has extensively engaged in long-term advisory to innovation hubs, innovation ventures, and large corporations in spearheading change through contemporary innovation and market delivery. Academically, Vijay is engaged with Cornell University, leading innovation, intellectual property management, and life sciences executive education programs. Over the last 2 decades, he has spearheaded academic technology transfer to markets and designed academic engagement in business translational hubs. He has been twice profiled in the Better World Award by Association of University Technology Managers for globally spearheading innovation delivery. Dr. Vijay is on the board of global development institutions and private corporations, providing strategic support for their growth initiatives. So with this brief introduction, welcome Dr. Vijay to the forum, and over to you.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful, gracious introduction, long one. I mean, truly appreciate the opportunity given, my wishes to Premnath and others today present, taking your time to be with us. The focus is essentials of technology licensing, and it's a overview of licensing framework and the process. And kindly put your questions as you have, so that we can be going at elements that are not covered in the presentation here. The academic technologies generate economic value through technology delivery. That's when they create research results, several of them have potential to be delivered to markets, and some of them, of course, are fundamental in nature, which provide opportunity for more research to be translated, and they get into markets with a span of further research work in them. So the delivery of economic value of the academic inventions is through the technology licensing process, and that's where the connotation of licensing comes in. So what is a license, basically, right? License is primarily a business agreement between the provider of a value and the recipient of the value. So to that extent, every licensing transaction is a transaction of contracts, basically, right? Contract between a provider and a taker. It's enforceable legally, just as any law of contracts, would cover an agreement between a buyer and seller is. It's a transaction that happens after a series of business process. When I say business process, the process involves, appreciation of the asset that's put on the table, attributing a value to the asset, and numerous terms on which these assets get transferred from the provider to the buyer, right? So when I go and buy a house, it's a series of negotiation process. I look at the validity or title of the asset. I look at the value I can attribute to that, time it takes for me to occupy that house. And of course, elements that govern, the surrounding of the house, etc. So similarly, every asset from a research result has number of elements where attributed values determine the buyer's interest. and they go through a series of business process. So we articulate the value of the asset in the best possible manner so that the buyer appreciates it, and the buyer attributes a value. Right? Value connotation is different in different people. When I put my used car for sale, I may put a tag of 40,000, let's say a 30 lakhs or 20 lakhs, whatever it is, depending on the brand and number of years it's used. But the buyer may have their own attributes to that. They may do a test drive and come back and say, oh, this is what we can offer you, basically, right? But technology assets are more complicated. It needs an expert perspective about where can it take them through, how long does it take for that to be put to markets and things like that. So that's where it goes through a number of series of business process negotiations as such. So if you look at which element influences most the success of licensing, the key thing is the recipient, right? It's primarily largely depending on the critical factor of choosing the licensee, because that makes the whole value factor determinant, right? The idea of any one of us, be it from academic institution or the private entity, wanting to place an asset in a third party, right, by way of licensing. And by the way, since licensing is a bailment process, the asset ownership vests with me, but I'm not the one putting the asset to use. I'm actually relegating that to a third person by way of bailment contract, which is licensing contract. And therefore, I expect that to provide best of the result, right? That's where my objective is fulfilled. So the whole success of the transaction here is choosing the right licensee. And that depends on a deep analysis of who they are, where do they come from, why do we perceive them as the right fit for us, right? Now, it's one element that determines the model we create as a licensing transaction. Any bailment contract is very flexible, right? It's between a owner of the asset and the user of the asset. So I have lots of flexibility in determining license agreement, but the manner of structuring that transaction is a critical success of the whole asset deployment, right? Am I leaning on somebody who is highly market penetrated? Am I leaning on somebody who is a risk taker? So there's an element that comes in there. And for determining that suitor, I need to first review my own asset. What stage of development is that asset today? Is that a disruptive asset? Does it have multiple application opportunity? The researchers, the inventors would have drilled down some application opportunity, but potentially they may have pointers to others as well. So, and what's the market potential? Assessing that is so critical based on unique selling proposition the asset has got. And what's the time scale? How long does it take to go through the market entry, right? Estimating that is a complex element because, some products are regulated, some are not. And if you're putting the products in regulated market and if you're putting it in the rest of the world, they are two different time frames altogether. Some products may have multiple market entry opportunity at different points of time. Some may have dominant players restricted to limited territories. They may not be overarching in their market presence. So I think these are elements that really determines the type of licensee we choose, right? And licensing as such can be to varied kind of recipients, right? The large ones are, of course, the big companies, which we used to do a lot of licensing, 10, 15 years ago. 70% of the transactions used to be big companies because they are in the framework of investing in translational research and taking them to products. They can take the risk. Big pharma companies, for example, invest in close to about 100 products. Eventually, they take about 4 or 5 of them to markets, but they have a pipeline. So that provides the interest for them to take to mid-level TRL kind of assets there. Then license to startups is the biggest thrust today, mainly because of their speed and ability, and also potential for them to secure both dilutive and non-dilutive investments to do rapid translation, and therefore they become a favored recipient of the opportunity. Then there are, of course, universities encouraging their inventors, be it students or the inventing faculty, to establish ventures and spearhead the translation within the venture. And the university may partake equity or may not. They may have different kind of stakeholding, either ownership based or some kind of affiliation that's not actually ownership based. And then there are, opportunity for looking at a Bailey within the country, outside the country, one with the presence globally from within the country, one who has presence in India, but also globally present. So those are all, again, options that we have. In effect, we have three models now: academia or the industry inventor looking at a third party large company, academia or industry inventor looking at early stage company, academia or the inventor entity creating a spin out entity, which has some bit of a stake by them to advance the interest themselves. Now, the key thing we talked about is finding the Bailey for us, or identifying a set of people, a set of entities that become our canvas for us to pitch the opportunity. And that's an important assessment we do, right? Assessing market relevance is so critical. First is we all look at deeply characterizing the invention that provides us the understanding of where the asset is prevailing today, what are the best application opportunities, where are the territories it would find value, and then all the inventive features that normally you get disclosed by the inventor but validated by you, and that would really provide us an opportunity comparison with the state of the art in the market and determine what are the contours of the asset that beats the state of the art today, right? Does it create new market opportunities? When you look at, I remember early on when Apple came with the iRiver, the music, empanelment in the electronic format. It had a number of features that beat actually all the headphones those days, right? Sony and others, because it helped you to go to in an embedded song of about 100, you can fast track it or choose the one that you want to go to. Whereas in conventional ones, you have to go through in a sequential manner to reach those songs. And so there are elements where disruption is quite possible, that a new element of a customer experience is possible there, right? New element of marketable opportunities possible. So are they creating new opportunities, and the economic value of that? Where do I place the product compared to the competitors? Is that a price determinant or a price follower or a new price framework creator? So those are kind of things that really determines application potential, the segments where application can come in. A lot of elements in life sciences have multiple applications, right? Could be in plants, humans, animals. Technology like gene editing has a broad spectrum applications in eukaryotic as well as prokaryotic models there. So those are application element that gets in to determine where can this be applied. When early generation of gene editing like talents came in, they didn't even perceive full application potential in all the living organisms. But then it became very clear that this has such a broad spectrum application potential. The canvas became far larger and wider. So those are elements that come to understanding when you drill down the technology landscape much, much more from a market perspective, right? And when it comes to problem solving, the inventor may not have perceived all the elements that the invention can solve. So when you get to the markets, you get to know what they are and how can that be, how can that be applied in the context, and therefore they become relevant for us. So those are, I think, some of the elements that really comes in when you look at a market perspective of the invention value, and that becomes so critical, right? Now, when you look at these assets that are in the translation phase, not the whole canvas of market will be obvious and visible, but it evolves. And that's one of the reasons why the market technology interface becomes so critical for us to kind of visualize the opportunity that the product has potential to reach. Some near term, some broad prospective opportunities that may be long-term applications, some validated very well, some kind of on hypothesis level. So all of that is still potentially important for licensee to look at. Now, the potential shift that we look at could sometimes be very marginal. It doesn't matter. Industry still appreciates it. Any incremental invention is good for industry, because they want to look at a short-term beating of the markets, and it's easy for them to transition it. So I think those are, we don't really discount those that are incremental inventions, and still find opportunities where they can be looked at for a market entry in a shorter span of time. Sometimes they may not even go through a regulatory hurdle, right? So those are elements that come in. But the challenge sometimes is that the invention, deliverable may not by themselves be a standalone application factor, right? Maybe you may club with other inventions, other platforms, and therefore, it's not a asset that I can deliver by itself. I need to combine it with, other assets I may not own myself. So there are some of the complications that come in. So I need to get access to those assets for me to deliver a comprehensive, deployable asset by the licensee. So I think those are some of the elements that comes up when you go into this techno-commercial kind of due diligence by you. Now, always people say, the market should be growth-driven, otherwise the licensees may not be interested. That's true, but sometimes the technology itself can change the perspective. It can convert a declining market to a growth phase, right? So those are disruptive elements that changes the ambit of market's landscape itself. So we need to factor that in mind. So we don't really discount a market opportunity that's in the decline or sunset stage, because that's by itself a canvas that may open up potential for a new drawing to be created on the canvas, right? So this is where our mapping of a techno-commercial element becomes so critical for us. And then we look at potential targets for us. With this, we look at the 7 or 8 elements that really helps me to drill down a prospect opportunity. One of the key elements, other than element that we looked at in terms of the market presence, the territorial presence, etc., it would be the risk appetite, right? There are entities that excel in the risk appetite, and therefore they are more engaged in validating potential disruptive technologies. There are some who are risk averse, but they have a strong market presence. They always come in later when products are hitting the market, the success is seen. They go and acquire those companies, right? These are buyout masters. So they don't have any appetite for early stage. They say, let the others who have expertise and ability and energy for that do that. We only come in to expand the market presence, market footprint. So in those cases, we discount them. They're not our choice at all. So over a period of time, in the tech transfer world, we are looking at the now system of the risk profile of the companies. And that's very, very important factor for us to narrow down some of the low-hanging opportunity for us to pitch our asset. And we also have the whole lot of past experiences with the enterprises, and that really helps us also understand risk profile. There are risk profile we understand from industry peers. We always look at others to know how is a transaction with them? Are they one with a risk perspective in this segment, right? So those are some of the third-party, signals that we get as well. Now, once you identify the entity, it may be entities because you don't really narrow down to one entity, and then you look at the potential possibility of taking that to next stage, which is basically looking at, who are they? Are they wants to take the discussions forward? Because any kind of business negotiation from there on is a series of iterative process, and therefore it's time consuming. So we can't be doing it with multiple entities, right? So narrowing down that is very critical there. And then we get on to, the whole transaction, and our essential target here is to wrap up the whole business process with a value determinant that provides the consideration for the asset transfer and a model of benefit flow that the owner of the asset gets or secures from the deployer, right? And that's what gets into a license agreement. And that's the core of the technology transfer process, right? You really celebrate with the champagne when actually license agreement is signed out. That's the final step for us to accomplish. And the criticality is that, we always start with a broad spectrum license agreement templates. There are numerous templates available, with several publications. But eventually, every license agreement is unique in its own respect, right? There are standard lease agreements or standard rental agreements or asset owner agreement when you go into purchasing a property. But those are more standardized, in terms of if one person in the society buys an asset, everybody follows the same agreement there, right? But tech transfer is very different because of the nature of the deployment of an asset, which is intangible. The underlying intellectual property, it could be a utility patent, it could be design patent, it could be a trademark. So these are different assets that you're looking at. It could be copyright. So even the nature of the asset framework itself makes technology transfer agreements different. There are always elements of stages of technology that would require a definitive business plan to be drawn and milestone to be determined, and those milestones could be very different for different assets. So those are all embedded in the agreement. And there is this whole lot of benefit flow. Assets that go into market in the near term have a different structure of benefit flow. Assets that takes longer span has a different structure of benefit flow. When the licensee opts to pay out a large money upfront, they have a different benefit flow. When they prefer a deferred payment, such as a startup company, they have a different benefit flow. So all of these are elements that gets in negotiation when license agreement is constructed, right? And that's where you have 10 to 12 iterations of license agreement. It's not more a legal process. Legal process succeeds the business process first. It's all like structuring the value proposition, determining the benefit flow, determining the rights that the Bailey will secure, determining checks and precautions when the assets are not put to deployment, determining the manner where oversight is maintained on the Bailey for responsible deployment of the asset. So all of that gets into license agreement, right? And license agreement has some standard covenants, some distinctive covenants that are embedded through the negotiation process. I'm not going to go into very detailed structure, the anatomy of the license agreement, but just give you an overview for you. There are two elements there in any licensing, which is exclusive possession of the assets for deployment. We have no more than single Bailey there. Other bailments are precluded because the Bailey gets the full right to deploy the asset, and no one has the right. It could be for a definitive period, it could be through the length of the agreement tenor, but that's something for determination based on the mutual negotiation, right? It could be a right of the Bailey for exclusivity in some territory, or it could be world at large. Again, that's a matter of negotiation that comes in. It could be a waiver of that covenant of exclusivity on certain events occurring, such as the Bailey not securing regulatory approval in a span of time, So those are again, elements that might nullify the rights of exclusive bailment. So these are elements where the contractual framework is very modular, depending on the nature of transaction that comes in there. And the first part of the agreement is always understanding and describing the institutional anatomy of the bailer and bailee, and then putting in standard definitions, because in license agreement there are a number of industry terminologies that we deploy, and there are scientific terminologies that really cover underlying assets of the license agreement, right? Both go into definitions. The third element of definition is the business terminologies. When we say a calendar year as a payment date, that's a business terminology. When we say taxes applicable on royalty payments, that's a business terminology, right? So the terminologies could be the element of technology defined, the element of licensing terms defined, and the element of the business terms defined. All three elements go into definition part of the license agreement. And the key thing is the benefit flow model, which is what the obligation of the bailee to pay to the bailer, based on the asset deployment in the market or otherwise, right? I mean, many times benefit flow does not necessarily arise only when assets are placed in the markets, right? It can arise during the time when the bailee has access to the asset and therefore deploys it for either for validation or for comparison. So those are pre-market access to the asset by the bailee, and therefore we have multiple points. It may be just an option agreement with the bailee where they try the asset. Let me see what kind of throughput it provides. Let me see the science. Kind of transferability into product at scale, which is scale-up validation. It could be looking at product deployment forms. If it's a drug, what is the best form to be deployed? Is that injectable or oral, whatever? It's also the estimation of time span because of the regulatory pathway that I may have to draw for the product, depending on composition of the product, and of course the regulatory framework that applies. So these are elements where I seek from a licensor opportunity for me to hold the asset for some time and validate these elements. That's where the option agreement comes in. And those are the period where there is always a compensation paid for that, though it's nominal in many cases, to make sure that there is a responsible deployment of that during the option tenure. And then there are always exchange value by way of upfront payment. There are seldom cases where there's a zero upfront payment, because that provides a value factor for the licensor and for the licensee responsibility to take it forward, having passed on some consideration. Even from a law of contracts, we make sure that there's a consideration that benefits the licensor clearly for passing on the asset to the licensee for deployment. And there are always some benchmark benefit flow, such as minimum payments. These are irrespective of whether the licensee reaches a threshold market access or not. And that really is a bearing for licensee to accelerate their own interest in the market. Otherwise, they're going to have a cost hurdle to them without benefit flowing to them. And therefore, normally we have a minimum benefit flow or a royalty payment during the validation process itself. In case of drugs and pharmaceuticals, if the phase 2, phase 3 trials are going to take like 3 to 4 years, during the phase, there are certain minimum royalty payments that are commanded, though nominal. And when they get to the markets, there's always a ramp-up time, depends on the entity. So we would put minimum royalty payments during the market scale-up period, right? So those are essential gatekeeping kind of revenue that the licensor secures. And there's always an element of other than royalty revenue, because the cost of holding the asset, especially the patent management cost, the legal cost, etc., is always borne by the licensee, and therefore, beyond milestone payments, beyond royalty payments, the licensee also is obligated to a number of other cost elements that they are allowed to pick up on them. And all the time, the licensor would say, I would require the net benefit flow to me. I'm not going to be subjecting myself to fiscal levy, and you have to bear it, right? This is another point of negotiation that comes in. I would say pay net of taxes to me, with the tax on your shoulder, not on mine. And it becomes a complicated one because you are grossing up, their tax obligation, and on the grossed amount, you're paying tax yourself as a licensee. But those are again subject to negotiations there. There are, number of benchmark pre-existing covenants that are incorporated in the license, that again has obligations of certain benefit flow coming in. These may be for, some of the background IP that are bartered by the licensor and provided to licensee, and obligations of those bartered IP. Let's say if I have a vaccine developed by my entity and I'm licensing it to licensee, but then I'm also picking up asset from another institution that provides a licensee a delivery platform, let's say a sublingual platform or other modes of delivery platform, and those are assets belonging to third entity. If I deliver a combined asset to the licensee, I then combine the obligations of the third party as well, because I'm entering into a comprehensive license agreement, and underlying that license agreement is a third party obligation that the licensee will have to bear, right? So every asset may have few subcomponents of underlying other license, covenants that are incorporated into the master license covenant, and it's generally between one licensor and licensee that the transaction management is best addressed. So everything, becomes underlying subcontract of the licensor with other co-licensors or co-asset owners who have provided components of their assets to the licensee, right? We do not really, it's very, very complicated to manage multiple licensors for the same asset. That becomes a nightmare for licensee to seek certain asset delivery, as well as suing, in the markets when kind of prosecution proceedings happen there. The licensee themselves may not go to all the markets. They have arms of them. That could be other entities where stronghold market presence determines, their interest in the technology, and therefore they have multiple sub-licensees generally. If you look at in India, asset like BT Cotton from Monsanto has almost like 35 sub-licensees, several seed companies, because they have territorial strength. They have products that they can incorporate this invention and take it to markets. So speed is the essence of reaching markets. So every licensee looks at multiple arms of delivery for them to speed up market dominance by them. So sub-licensing is more ubiquitous than exception. So managing sub-licensee, modeling that is important for licensor to make sure that benefit flow is equitable in that, right? Now, there are very important elements with respect to management of the asset itself. While I own the house and rent it, I don't want my titles to be put at jeopardy. So I put certain onus on even the tenant to make sure that the asset ownership is not jeopardized. It's more important in intangibles such as patents. So maintaining patents is so critical. Determining when there are challenges to that on a timely prosecution is so critical. Defending it in the court of law is so critical. So we do determine rights and responsibilities of the licensee and licensor, and contextually safeguard the asset by ensuring the key responsible elements that both will be obligated to. Invariably, of course, there are cases where licensee is put to disadvantage when there are injunctions to asset sale. a product sale in the market, and licensor is equally responsible in those circumstances to defend. And those are elements that are again put in as well. Terminating, right? Eventually, not that I said license a business transaction, not that every business transaction is absolutely successful. Some of them get aborted, not necessarily by the fault of licensor or licensee, by default occurrence of certain elements. Maybe I worked on a product and regulations block it. That's one potential reason. Maybe there are legal elements that are blocking it. Maybe there are IP deficiency that has a prosecution challenge. So there could be many kind of termination potential that may result in aborting the contract, and those are incorporated, clearly defining circumstances where they get aborted, right? And once the transaction is done, licensing is executed, responsibilities post-license is very important. As a house owner, I would like to retain responsibility to inspect the house when I leave it on rent. I would like to make sure that what are my, default rights when rents are not paid on time. So I think those are elements of rights that come in. So there are a number of post-execution dynamics that are well laid out in the agreement itself, including right of the licensor to go into the books of the licensee to see whether fair compensation is paid back or not, to look at deployment of the asset by the licensee in the field of use that's designated and not misused in other fields of use, to ensure that licensee has paid appropriate value on the revenue they earn, which are basically revenue audits that provide the licensor the comfort that they got the compensation back. If they have stacked technologies, not just from me, but from others into my asset, or my asset has been stacked to somebody else's asset, have we both got the fairness of the compensation? And that's another element that comes in there. So these are elements of compliance that came in. It's a continuous dialogue process, right? I mean, it's once married, they are continuing to engage until the span of the license agreement. And therefore, it's a dialogue that happens. There are numerous cases where we go back, review the agreement, and amend it, right? And there are some license agreements which have series of 20, 30 amendments in a span of 15 years. Because these are elements that come up as a post-market entry process, as probably elements where the asset is deployed in more fields of use. Territories are added when they see a market potential. Sub-licensees are added when they expand the footprint through sub-licensees. Royalty elements where the ambiguities are made more firm and clear. If there are patent prosecution, there are covenants resulting out of that are court prescribed. So a number of elements that results in amending a license agreement. So this is something that we see it as a continuous process. One of the elements that I've seen as a bartered great technology is a microfilament, for diabetic retinopathy as an implant in the ophthalmology application, developed by a great institution that we were managing the asset. When we looked at, the asset was of course picked up by a multinational company, and when we really look at the deployment freedom, we realized that the substrate material they used was having prior constraint with an IP embedded with the multinational company, another multinational company. And therefore, negotiations started with another multinational company, and then the compensation demand was far larger than the ability or interest of the licensee to pick it up, and therefore the transaction got aborted, right? So these are several transactions that get aborted while licensing agreements are drawn, but there are numerous transactions that get aborted post-license on account of such complications that come. The another case that we have looked at is a product that got into validation and testing, a recombinant product, and then the country stipulated a kind of embargo on such recombinant products. So after going through a phase 2 trial, it was aborted through several, they could not revive the process, and the regulations continue to remain like that. And there are some agreements that get time barred when these kind of regulatory bottleneck come in, and both the licensor and licensee would have done a 4-year agreement as the initial phase for milestones, and then they don't occur, and then the license becomes infructuous unless both the party agree to revive it again. There are some levels of limitation that arises on account of legal impediments. There are some limitations that occur because of export restrictions. We have done some contracts where from United States, our asset manager, licensing agreement has been done to another entity for 14 countries, and then US brought in export restriction to 3 of those countries. So we had to amend the agreement to bar any kind of asset access by those countries. Recent past, we have had in the United States several kind of complications on account of products or components in asset that's come from Chinese Western region, Rohingya, the northwestern region, and if there are assets as a component in that from the region, the institution is prohibited from transferring that asset. So these are stage kind of complications that come where you don't know that they ever existed, and they come and hit you, so that asset is put on hold, unfortunately. So those are several cases of premature termination that comes, and then we move on, forgetting the transaction and closing that component there. So these are, broad elements of licensing. As I said, it's a comprehensive business process. The element of business process involves clearly mutually equal perspective about the underlying science and technology. And that's very essential for business negotiation. If there are bandwidth deficiencies between licensor and licensee and the prospective asset, the business negotiation gets prolonged. And therefore, the equal wavelength of the perspective of the science and technology in the asset is very critical. That makes the business negotiation smoother. And once you have that, the canvas then moves to creating the compensation model, the responsible structure that licensor and licensee will be subjecting themselves to, and then licensing agreement becomes a joy to enter into, right? So those are critical elements that counts. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. I think you're done with your slides, right?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, thank you. I thought people can raise their hands or feel free to type their questions. In the meantime, maybe I'll pose a couple of questions as well. You can unshare if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that will.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so just a couple of quick questions, which just to set the stage, and others can ask as well. Can you comment on the kind of typical limitations that are placed on licenses, right? And what are the different variations people can use to sort of slice and dice the licensing that they're providing?
Yeah. So there are set of 5 elements that really determine the limitations. Of course, the key limitation is the field of use itself.
Yeah.
We don't want to give away everything. Companies want as much as they can. So we limit it to what we perceive are their, masterstroke advantage in the particular field of use. That's one element clearly. Territory is another one. Everybody wants the whole territory in their ambit. We don't mind giving it, but we do ensure compulsory sub-licensing at our will, if we see that they're not the best for the whole territory factor. Third is the regulations. I think, regulations are a bottleneck for many. So we do have a very, very important discussion on the ability of the licensee to take the product through regulations. So we would have, limitations on them to solely pursue it. There are many cases where responsibility is cast on them to involve organizations and that can qualitatively pursue regulations. So those are a number of elements that really becomes. In a startup entity, now we are stipulating that, if they are pursuing regulations themselves, there has to be quality enterprise that have either maybe a CRO kind of a thing that would be essential to take the product through that phase of it. So third-party involvement is another one that becomes also point of negotiation.
When do you want to suggest some pointers on where would you go exclusive versus non-exclusive or other variations? How do you also preserve your rights as a licensor to pursue things further and so on?
Right. So one thing that we look at for exclusivity is the span of deliverable for the product in the markets. Longer the span, demand for exclusivity is well justified. The territorial presence of the licensee, if they have a wider territorial presence, we are not so much jeopardized by exclusivity because we would have a compulsory right to sub-license to territories where they are not probably present today. The other element of exclusivity is also determined by their ability to steer the product through the validation phase themselves. That's another factor, and our past experience with them as responsible deployer of asset in exclusive licensing agreement. Now, the checks and balance are always we ensure that we have the right to deploy the asset, for our own research. That's mandatory. Even in case of privately owned asset in a private corporation, we do stipulate that because future results are, dependent on these prior art for us to pursue further research. In academia, it's must as such, because not just me, but my associates in research also will deploy the asset. Second element is default rights, where certain covenants will get me back to the annulment of the bailment, and therefore the asset falls back to me, restricting them to further deploy. So these are milestones which are very well drawn after due negotiations, with some level of lead time provided for them. Maybe we say phase 1 to be done in 24 months. There could be a lead time of 4 months or 5 months, and those are default lines where asset could get back to my lap. So those are elements that are put in, and those are parts of the business plan that are drawn carefully in case of long gestation assets. Most startups would ask for exclusivity. They're always very time bound. The whole idea of the startup is to enrich the asset and then pass it over to a large company in many cases. Seldom they get to markets themselves. I'm not saying it's a rule, but that's the way they are. And therefore, they need the exclusive rights for them to command a value when they transfer the asset to a larger entity. So they're considered, but timelines are very rigidly drawn because startups, go through ups and downs in fundraising. That's what happens there.
So I'll request Vanita Prasad from Ravi to ask a question. I think I've pressed.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. This is very opt talk. I was just coming from a company negotiation where they want to license patent. I just brief myself. What I am trying to do is I have done a microbial consortia for waste or wastewater treatment. Using this consortia, we can get biogas. And as we know, these reactors are very big in size, and we need to supply these cultures in bulk. So we need to produce it somewhere, and then only we can supply. So we had a very small pilot plant, which has been given to us as demonstration plant from Vijayraghavan. And from there, we could able to demonstrate. And now we are getting an orders of in tunes of 600 meter cube kind of order by one company or one industry itself. So PAX is one of our competitor, and they are looking to this. And just now I'm coming from a biogas plant, this thing, because under Satat, a bigger plants has to come. So I need to understand this licensing model, because I cannot produce this much amount of culture because their reactors are very big. So how can we go ahead with this licensing model? Because this culture has been protected under patent across globe. US is granted, India is granted. We have this granted patent with us. So
who has the patent? Do you have the patent with you?
Yes, the Ravi as a start.
Okay, you have the global patent for the culture, but you're not passing over the culture to the licensee, right? You're giving the product to them.
Yeah, one way is we will produce this product and supply it.
Yeah, which is not a license agreement because it's supply agreement primarily. But if you
no, sir.
as a microorganism, it's a different game altogether, right?
Yeah.
So there are no restrictions for you to pass the microorganism because you have the ownership for the asset. just that you have to comply with, the other regulatory requirements such as National Biodiversity Authority, etc. Any microorganism transfer has certain elements of uniqueness, because these microorganisms can be applied in many respects, and they combine with the process technology, right? When you say your bioreactors could be aerobic, anaerobic, you would have done your process patent as well. So the know-how combines with the microorganism. That's where it makes the relevance, right? Otherwise, sheer microorganism has limited value for the licensee. So you have a two kind of framework of assets there: the bioproperty, which is microorganism. Second is the process patent that you would have already filed and got it. So those are the two elements that gets licensed, and combined that makes value for the licensee there. If they're going to produce it themselves, and if you're going to pass the organism to them. If you're going to retain the microbes with you, you're going to produce it in small scale, large scale, whatever it is, it's a pure supply contract. There's no question of any licensing agreement coming in there.
Sorry, Vanita, did it answer your question, or do you want to?
Yeah, sir has answered my question. If I am giving it as a product, then I have to have a supply agreement, which
Absolutely.
very different terms. If I want to give them this as a seed culture and they can grow in their reactors, because their reactors are very big. So that is the model which I am trying to really understand, and then I can talk to these bigger players in the market.
Yeah.
So those if I can contact you later also to understand the terms and condition, what should be there, it will be very helpful for me to talk to these people.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, in NCL Venture, you have experts who can really guide you there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Vanita, you can write to us.
Yes,
we'll
sir.
Connect as needed with Vijay as well. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So let's move to the next question. There was a question about spin-out licensing in the chat box. Do you want to comment on that a little bit in terms of?
So in case of, we talked about those 5 models of licensing.
Yeah.
In case of spin-out licensing, there are dual, role and entitlement and obligations for me as asset owner, right? I'm just not passing the asset for Bailey to deploy, but I'm also taking a stake in it. I'm a co-owner of that, right? So there are 2 obligations for me as owner of the asset and owner of the entity, which is actually taking the asset to market. And any kind of a co-ownership in an entity comes with obligations, right? Obligations of stewardship of the enterprise itself. So it's not just stewardship of technology, but also enterprise. So we lay down to what level my ownership will be, embedded in the entity, what percentage of that company I will have for me in lieu of, payment that would otherwise be accruing to me, right? In a spin out, you're not going to look at multiple source of revenue for a certain length of time. And it's only the paper asset that you get as equity in that company. And that's your value. It may have a large uprise as we go. It may be that the spin-out company takes the product to validation. We were just looking at a spin-out company that we put in some equity as asset manager. And this month, the last month, they really looked at an encashment for that. And it's like a multiple of about 20 times or so of the original value we determined. So in drugs and pharmaceuticals, even getting a phase 2A, 2B would get that kind of upscale, and those are equity, capital gains that the asset owner gets, right? Mm-hmm. So we are doing a license agreement. We also do 2 other agreements, or they could be combined, one agreement for all the 3. The 2 other agreements are, one is shareholder agreement, other one is a share subscription agreement, right? Shareholder agreement is agreement inter-se shareholders. Me, the founder, the investor, or investors in the company. So those are all inter-se parties to shareholder agreement. Share subscription agreement is agreement between me and the company for me to subscribe share. And then therefore determine my rights. Should I have a board position in it or not? When can I dispose of shares? What are the information I'm entitled to get? All of that becomes part of share subscription agreement. There are cases we combine all the 3 into do one share subscription and license agreement. Generally, it's more complicated, so we keep them all 3 separate agreements.
Mm-hmm. I'll request S. Venkatesan to ask his question. Vijay, we can go till another 5 minutes, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm okay. Yeah.
So actually, I just want some clarification between this licensing and supply agreements. So, like, what can be licensed and what should be coming under the supply? Because I have a person, one of our startups, they developed a software solution and they want to give the platform as a white labeled solution to multiple vendors. So I want to know, like, if that will come in a licensing or a supply agreement.
So in case of software, it's a little complicated because in India, there's a limited patent protection for software. I mean, you're all aware of that. So copyrights are generally the protection that the developers seek and secure. So when you have software embedded in a product you deliver to the licensee, the product could have a design patent. The copyrights would be the protection for the software part of it. So these two are combined and delivered to the user, right? Even in a medical device, many times algorithm is embedded into that, so they become copyright ownership there. So we do a comprehensive license agreement that really brings out these components of asset ownership. Copyrights, or could be design patents, or could be, if there are some adjuvants going into that, there could also be utility patent. So all of them are combined, and the asset transfer is done. If you just have software as an asset, nothing else, let's say a new software is drawn in an existing design, then you have only copyright protection. So we do copyright license agreement there.
Okay. But this person doesn't want to give the software. He just wants to hold the software. He's only giving the
If they're not passing the source code, we do a shrink wrap agreement on the usage. Like today, when I go and buy a Microsoft product, I don't get the source code. I just do a click wrap agreement or shrink wrap agreement, and then the asset is provided to me for usage. I don't get underlying source code for me. That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay. So that comes in a licensing, or it comes in?
It's a license agreement because I provide the product usage to them. And therefore that gives them legal right to deploy that software in their own further development or in their product application, but they don't get access to source code. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Vijay, I just wanted to request if you can talk a little bit about situations where there is forward IP from both the licensee and the licensor, right? That means post the licensing, and how should they be dealt with, especially if there is new know-how and technology coming up, and who owns what? What are the ways this is dealt with, please?
Okay, so this is slightly differently done by academic institution and the private industry licensor. In case of academic institution, if they have a long-standing presence in the market and are in commanding position to determine, certain privilege with the licensee, any kind of a forward IP that comes in as a post-license discovery by the licensee, they provide access to licensor for self-deployment, right? Not for third-party deployment or market deployment. So I get the access, and as an academic institution, I want it for my research, deployment. So I get that, and it's enshrined in the agreement itself. Otherwise, unless the patent that I have licensed has a dominant influence on the derivative inventions, I don't claim right to those patents as a co-inventor. If there are incremental claims, within the family of claims, and my underlying patent is the primary patent still, I would really claim access to co-ownership in that also in the incremental invention. That's where the academic policy is largely. In case of private sector, it's more complicated. The private sector licensor, let's say a chemical entity is licensed to a crop protection company, and the crop protection company further enhances the value by repurposing it or combining with another compound, and they find a better application. In those cases, we do stipulate an incremental royalty flow on the deployment of combining this asset with other assets, or by the improvement they have done, and that incremental royalty flow is generally difficult to determine upfront. So we do leave certain windows open there, defining areas where incremental flow will be necessity or an obligation by the licensee when they engage in improving the asset. And these are normally discussed in the business plan. Even the licensee will say, oh, these are things where we see potential, we have expertise, and they are brought in. But it's always not that we can draw the whole canvas, on the agreement framework itself. Yeah, so therefore, it's a little more dynamic with the private sector.
Okay, there's one question from Archana, which I'll request her to ask herself. Archana, can you unmute and ask?
Yeah, yes, sir. So I just wanted to ask, can we have sub-licensing rights in the non-exclusive license agreement, and is it regular practice? And if yes, what would be the financial arrangements?
Yeah, it's a little complicated one. See, normally what happens, a licensor, reduces the burden on the shoulder by sub-licensing, right? Let's say I stipulate to my licensor upfront payment of 1 crore. Now, they pay the 1 crore to me, but when they sub-license to 3 other entities, they, pass on a part of that obligation to them, right? They recover back maybe 25 lakhs from each of 3 sub-licensee, right? So eventually all the 4 would have picked up, 25 lakhs cost on them. So sub-licensing in a way, reducing the burden on the shoulder of the licensee in paying milestone payment, upfront payments. When you have non-exclusive license agreements, there could be huge variance between sub-licensees of those non-exclusive license agreements. So therefore, we say that, other thing that sub-licensee will demand is, if a beneficial sub-license covenants are given to another sub-licensee, they should have parity, right? So in many cases, we go back, readjust the sub-license money received. Now, when I do 3 sub-licensees, I collect 25 lakhs. Let's say I determine a 5th sub-licensee and the 4th sub-licensee. They also pay 25 lakhs, and I surpass my overall 1 crore I paid, right? So 4th and 5th negotiate with me to pay only 15 lakhs. And then I have to keep parity for all the 3 other earlier sub-licensee by refunding the 10 lakhs additionally collected. So if you create more multiple sub-licensees and a different, non-exclusive licensees, creating this parity is a real complexity. You handle 15, 20 entities, equalize all of their obligations at the same time. So nightmare it will be. So this is where we avoid that actually.
But Vijay, I think the point also is in a non-exclusive license agreement, you also as a licensor have the right to do another license to somebody else.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And your licensee also has, if they have sub-licensing rights, right? Will there be a conflict?
I mean, normally, even a non-exclusive license agreement, some of them demand sub-licensing because they have these affiliates in other countries, third-party agreements they have. Drugs and pharmaceuticals very common because they do the sub-license agreements with their associates. They may have strong presence in the territory. Rest of the countries, they go through their affiliates. So non-affiliates, sorry. So those are kind of things where sub-licensing is fine to go with. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I think we have covered a lot of ground today. Thank you very much. I don't want to keep you too long. I'll hand it over back to our organizing team, Mugdha and Sharvari, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vijay. Brilliant session. And requesting all of you, the participants to give your feedback also. The link is there in the chat box. And Dr. Vijay, if there are any questions beyond this session, we will reach out to you over email separately.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Exactly. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful interaction. Truly appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Premnath, for taking time and leading it today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vijay, for
Thank you.
taking the time.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.